you don't have to be a political commentator to see that even the most centrist, neoliberal, establishment-friendly 2020 Democratic Party presidential contender is sounding more and more like Bernie Sanders, at least when it comes to the economy and economic issues. However, when it comes to the issue of foreign policy thus far, even if it's still early, there is a serious lack of anyone really laying out a truly progressive foreign policy vision, with the exception of one person, Tulsi Gabbard. And if you are running to be the commander-in-chief, then foreign policy should be something that you talk about quite extensively, but really nobody's talking about that. Do you have a foreign policy vision where you try to nation build and direct, the empire just to different regimes in different countries? Or are you actually going to bring the troops home and stop advocating for more wars? Stop being the party that goes along with neocons and Republicans when they opt for more regime change wars. And at this point, it just doesn't look very good. Take the issue of Venezuela, for example. Kirsten Gillibrand actually supports the U.S. coup, saying we should recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela. John Delaney says pretty much the same thing. Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar have expressed reservations about Maduro, but still haven't really said much. We have others like Sherrod Brown, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg giving vague responses about Venezuela needing free and fair elections, not really saying much. We have Bernie Sanders putting out a really milquetoast response, speaking out against regime change and military intervention, but not really straying too far from the DC consensus here. In other words, nobody, no candidate thus far, has really taken a strong, unequivocal stance against any U.S. meddling in Venezuela, except for Tulsi Gabbard. She said this: the U.S. needs to stop using our military for regime change and stop intervening in Venezuela's military. Throughout history, U.S.-led regime change has been waged in the name of humanitarianism, but has resulted in more suffering, destruction, and lives lost. Hands off Venezuela. And that's not the only statement that she gave, because she also called out Donald Trump's insidious agenda for Venezuela when she launched her campaign just a couple of weeks ago.
Now, President Trump campaigned against regime change wars when he ran for president, but now he bows to the wishes of the neocons who surround him, clamoring for regime change wars that he claimed to oppose, this time in Venezuela and in Iran. These powerful politicians dishonor the sacrifices made by every one of my brothers and sisters in uniform, their families, as they are the ones who pay the price for these wars. In fact, every American pays the price for these wars that have cost us trillions of dollars since 9/11. Every dollar that we spend on regime change wars or on the new Cold War and this nuclear arms race is a dollar coming out of our pockets. Dollars that should be used to address the very real urgent needs of our people and our communities right here at home.
Now, in case you missed it, she also did something that no other 2020 candidate has been willing to do thus far. She called out the saber rattling against Russia because, it's easy to see that there's this new DC consensus in both parties that we have to take an adversarial stance against Russia, when normal Americans don't want that. We don't want to live through another Cold War. Stop saber rattling. Stop being hawkish. Stop escalating. Stop using NATO troops to intimidate Russia at their border. Stop trying to push for more escalations. Now, they do this because the military-industrial complex makes profits from this. Even if there's not war, they still make money from saber rattling. They still have their stocks increase when candidates in both parties talk about war or talk in a really hawkish manner. So what Tulsi's doing here is something that no other candidate at this point has been willing to do. Now, also, she called out warmongers, and she took a snippet of her launch speech and she turned it into an ad that I thought was phenomenal.
We must stand up stand up against powerful politicians from both parties who sit in their ivory towers, thinking up new wars to wage, new places for people to die, wasting trillions of our taxpayer dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives, and undermining our economy and our security and destroying our middle class.
It was short but sweet, very concise. It got right to the point that she needed to make. That is what candidates should be doing. You run an ad that is 100% substance-based. Cut out all the bullshit about your personal stories. Cut out all the platitudes and just say it. Take a stand against war. So that was phenomenal. She also did something that was really clever, and she criticized neocons and neolibs simultaneously, because this is something we don't really talk about much, but neoliberalism and neoconservatism are often fused, because you have this regime change mentality that also is complemented by capitalism and free markets, because not only do you want intervention for purposes of U.S. national interests, but you want it because that helps out defense contractors. And in this next ad here, Tulsi Gabbard calls them both out because that's actually what's happening.
We must stand united and stand strong against those in both parties who never tire of war. Neocons and neolibs who drag us from one regime change war to the next, and who are exacerbating the new Cold War, pushing us to the brink of nuclear war. We deserve better. Our country deserves better.
So that was absolutely fantastic. And thus far, Tulsi Gabbard is the only candidate who is serious about promoting an anti-regime change, anti-war agenda. Now, with that being said, you all know that I have my questions about Tulsi Gabbard. What does she say about torture now? Her voting record has been pretty much anti-torture. That's great. What about drone strikes? Are you against drone strikes? Because even if you're against regime change wars, you still have to stop these drone strikes, because that violates the territorial integrity and sovereignty of these other countries. And quite frankly, they're illegal. They're against international law. Now you might say, well, why does that matter, Mike? Well, put it this way. If you had Russia doing drone strikes in Texas, would you not feel as if they didn't have the right to do that? Of course. We are terrorizing citizens in these countries. So she once said that she is a hawk when it comes to fighting terrorism, but she's a dove when it comes to regime change wars. I want to hear more about that. I want to know her stance on Israel-Palestine. So these are things that I want to know more about, but at this point, it's safe to say that Tulsi Gabbard is really the only person who is talking about this, and she's setting a bar that's very high. And she's basically elevating this issue and putting it in the conversation when it's been completely absent up until this point. Now, you all know that I'm a Bernie guy, and either Elizabeth Warren or Tulsi Gabbard is my number two. But with that being said, seeing Tulsi campaign, since she's launched, she's only gone up in my book. She's only gone up in my book. Elizabeth Warren has kind of stayed the same. She's done things that got on my nerves. For example, she stood up and applauded Donald Trump when he said that America will never be a socialist nation. To be fair, I don't know if Tulsi did or not because I can't see her in the video, but that irritated me. But then at her launch event, she actually talked about an economic agenda that was very bold, that was very progressive. So, I mean, it's difficult to say who's my true number two, but this is what I will say. Initially, I was leaning towards a Bernie Warren ticket, but I'm starting to lean more and more towards the combination of either a Bernie Tulsi ticket or an Elizabeth Warren Tulsi ticket, because if you have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the same ticket, even if that may be, I think, more acceptable to the establishment, well, you're just getting a lot of overlap because they're both really good on economic issues. But we need someone who's actually going to be good on foreign policy issues, because there's been this consensus that has been crafted over the past couple of years where both parties have essentially become neoconservative. We see saber rattling. We see Democrats taking an opposition to Donald Trump trying to do peace in North Korea. And even if he's in over his head and doesn't know what he's doing, you shouldn't just by default be against him because it's Donald Trump and any and all things he does is bad. If he's doing something good, then let him do something good. But they actually tried to stop him when he tried to put forward this plan to stop these military games and exercises that the United States does with South Korea near North Korea. So there's too many pro-war Democrats. They need to get back to the party that is anti-war, that's against the Iraq War, that's against intervention and U.S. imperialism. At this point, Tulsi Gabbard is the only person who's serious when it comes to that. So that's why increasingly I'm leaning more and more towards a Tulsi and Warren or a Tulsi and Sanders ticket. Because if you've got Bernie and Warren, even though that'd be a great ticket, there's just going to be a lot of overlap and no real urge to make the Democratic Party less hawkish and, less militaristic, which I think is incredibly important now. And that's also going to appeal to libertarians. So Tulsi Gabbard is definitely someone to watch, because even if there's a virtual blackout of her campaign in the mainstream media, when you see these articles by Harry Anton of CNN, who will talk about how diverse the field is and talk about how all of these candidates could be poised to make history, they don't talk about Tulsi Gabbard, who checks the most boxes. Not only would she be the first female president, she'd be the first Hindu president and woman of color president. She checks all of those boxes. So, there's this blackout. There's also the smears. There's the McCarthyite smear by NBC. But I don't think that these things are going to hurt her. There's real support for Tulsi Gabbard on the ground. And that's a good thing. I am worried, admittedly, about vote splitting on the progressive left. I think it's best if we consolidate our votes. But with that being said, what Tulsi is adding to the conversation is important. Foreign policy matters. And the fact that she's really the only person thus far who's talking about foreign policy and who has put forth a real anti-war agenda, that's important. It says a lot.
Subscribe if you like this video, folks. Mike's tremendous, and he's doing a really, really good job. Many people are telling me about how wonderful the Humanist Report is. Bigly.